The explosion echoed across Mirror Lake at exactly 6:47 a.m. while I was spreading my daughter's ashes from the stone bridge my great-great-grandfather built in 1923. When the smoke cleared, half of my family's century-old bridge lay in pieces at the bottom of the lake, and Victoria Sterling, the HOA president who'd been terrorizing our community for 2 years, stood on her $8 million lakeside mansion's deck, champagne glass in hand, filming my moment of grief with her phone. "Finally," she called across the water, her voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that only comes with generational wealth. "Maybe now we can bring some class to this neighborhood." What this Harvard-educated real estate heiress didn't know was that destroying my bridge had just activated a 100-year-old legal time bomb that would obliterate her entire empire. A secret my great-great-grandfather had buried in those stones that would expose the biggest environmental cover-up in state history and send shockwaves through every corporate boardroom in America. Have you ever had someone destroy the most sacred thing in your life just to prove they could? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because this story isn't just about revenge. It's about what happens when old money meets older secrets, and why sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption is a library card and an unbreakable will to seek justice. My name is Marcus Blackwood, and I'm about to show you how a 45-year-old history professor with a PhD in genealogical research brought down a multi-generational crime family using nothing but archived documents, environmental science, and the truth they'd been hiding for a century. I'm what academics call overeducated and underpaid, a history professor who specializes in industrial genealogy, which is a fancy way of saying I trace how families made their fortunes by studying the documents that most people throw away, burn, or bury in basement archives. For 20 years, I've been the guy universities call when they need someone to dig through moldy courthouse records, decode century-old handwriting, and piece together the real story behind America's great fortunes. My expertise isn't glamorous, but it's thorough. I can trace a family's financial history through marriage records, property deeds, corporate filings, and court documents that most people never know exist. What I didn't understand until 3 months ago was how that knowledge would become the most powerful weapon I'd ever wielded against the kind of evil that destroys children's lives for profit. My cabin sits on Blackwood Island, a 5-acre piece of paradise my great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel Blackwood, won in a poker game in 1923 from a railroad baron who thought a steel worker couldn't possibly understand the value of lakefront property. The baron was wrong about everything, especially about underestimating Ezekiel's intelligence. Ezekiel was a survivor of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, who'd come north with nothing but calloused hands, a genius-level understanding of metalwork, and a deep suspicion of wealthy people who built their fortunes on other people's graves. He'd seen firsthand how industrial accidents happened when workers asked too many questions about safety, and he'd learned to document everything. The island itself was magical in the way that only untouched places can be, towering pine trees that had watched over the lake for 2 centuries, creating a canopy so thick that summer afternoons felt like twilight, a small beach where the water was so clear you could count individual stones 20 feet down, and at the heart of it all, a log cabin that Ezekiel had built by hand, room by room, using techniques that made modern construction look like amateur hour. But the crown jewel was the bridge. Not just any bridge, a masterpiece of engineering that used a technique called embedded foundation anchoring that wouldn't be officially patented until 1967. Ezekiel had somehow intuited the physics of load distribution and stress management decades ahead of his time, creating a structure that had survived 100 winters, dozens of storms, and the kind of flooding that had destroyed every other bridge on the lake. The bridge had witnessed more family history than most churches. My great-grandfather had proposed to my great-grandmother there in 1925, returning from World War I, with a purple heart and a promise that he'd build a life worthy of her sacrifice. My grandfather had carried his bride across it in 1945 when he returned from Normandy, his left arm still weak from shrapnel, but his determination stronger than ever. My father had taught my mother to fish from that bridge in the summer of 1967, her city shoes completely inappropriate for the wooden planks, but her laughter echoing across the water as she learned to bait a hook for the first time. And 35 years later, I knelt on those same planks to propose to Sarah, my hands shaking not from nerves, but from the weight of continuing a tradition that had defined my family for generations. But the bridge's most sacred role had come 3 months ago, when I'd planned to stand there at sunrise with a small wooden box containing the ashes of my daughter Emma, who'd lost her battle with leukemia at age 16. Emma wasn't just my daughter. She was the best part of me made manifest, brilliant beyond her years, with her mother's compassion and my stubborn refusal to accept injustice. She'd planned to study environmental science, inspired by summers spent cataloging lake wildlife and testing water quality for science fair projects that consistently won state competitions. Even during chemo, when the treatments left her weak and nauseated, Emma would insist on spending evenings on the bridge with her books, Harry Potter mostly, but also advanced biology textbooks that she'd convinced her teachers to lend her. She'd sit with her feet dangling in the water, her bald head covered by a hand-knitted hat from her grandmother, telling me about Hogwarts and photosynthesis, and how someday she'd be a doctor who could cure kids like her. The irony that still keeps me awake at night is that Emma spent years studying environmental contamination for school projects, never knowing that she was living on top of the very pollution that was killing her. The last conversation we had was about industrial history. Emma had been researching our family genealogy and found references to chemical companies operating near Mirror Lake in the 1920s. "Dad," she'd said, her voice hoarse from treatments but her mind sharp as ever, "did you know that great-great-grandpa Ezekiel wrote letters to the government about companies dumping chemicals in the lake? I found them in the Historical Society archives. Don't you think that's weird for a steelworker to know about chemistry?" I dismissed it as coincidence. Old industrial practices, different environmental standards, nothing that could affect us a century later. I was so focused on fighting her cancer that I never investigated what she'd discovered. That was my first mistake. Emma had found the key to everything, and I'd been too overwhelmed by her illness to pay attention. The morning I planned to scatter her ashes was supposed to be private, just me, the sunrise, and a final goodbye to the most important person in my life. I'd chosen 6:45 a.m. because Emma had always been an early riser, and the light at that hour painted the lake in the same golden colors that had captivated her since childhood. The wooden box felt impossibly light in my hands as I prepared to open it, thinking about all the dreams and possibilities that had been reduced to a handful of gray powder. I was whispering to her, telling her about the scholarship fund I'd established in her name, and how her research had inspired me to dig deeper into our family history, when the explosion shattered the morning silence like a gunshot through a church. The blast came from beneath the bridge, shaped charges, I realized later, precisely timed and positioned for maximum structural damage. This wasn't vandalism or an accident. This was professional demolition designed to cause complete destruction while I was at my most vulnerable moment. The sound was deafening, a crack like thunder followed by the groaning of century-old oak as support beams snapped under impossible stress. I watched in horror as the northern section of the bridge, the exact spot where Emma and I had shared our last conversation, crumbled into the lake. Hand-forged steel joints that had held firm for 100 years suddenly gave way, sending chunks of my family's history into the dark water below. The vibration knocked me to my knees, and Emma's ashes scattered across the remaining planks, mixing with sawdust and debris from the bridge her great-great-great-grandfather had built with his own hands. I scrambled to gather what I could, my hands shaking as I tried to separate ash from wood shavings, but it was impossible. She was gone, mixed forever with the bridge she'd loved, and I couldn't even save her ashes from being desecrated. That's when I heard the laughter, cold, calculating, and completely devoid of human empathy. Victoria Sterling stood on her mansion's deck like a general surveying a conquered battlefield, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around a champagne flute that probably cost more than most people's car payments. She wasn't just watching, she was filming, her phone capturing my moment of absolute devastation for what I later learned was a social media post about successful infrastructure improvements and community beautification progress. Finally, she called across the water, her voice carrying the particular brand of cruelty that only comes with generational wealth and total indifference to human suffering. "Maybe now we can bring some class to this neighborhood. That eyesore has been blocking our view for far too long." The woman had just destroyed a century of family history while I was honoring my dead daughter, and her response was to celebrate with champagne and social media content. In that moment, looking at Emma's ashes mixed with the debris of our family bridge, I made a decision that would change everything. If Victoria Sterling wanted to destroy my family's legacy, I was going to destroy hers. But I wouldn't use explosives or intimidation or purchased violence. I would use the truth. And after 20 years of digging through archives, I knew exactly where to find it. Victoria Sterling arrived at Mirror Lake 18 months ago, like Sherman arriving in Atlanta, with a clear mission to burn everything down and rebuild it in her own image, but with better interior decorating and higher property values. Picture this: A 52-year-old woman who'd never worked a day in her life, armed with a Harvard MBA she'd bought with daddy's donations, driving a white Maserati with the license plate UPGRADED. She'd inherited $200 million from the Sterling industrial fortune when her father died in 2019, and decided that our quaint little fishing community had potential if you removed all the quaint and all the fishing and replaced it with luxury amenities for people who thought roughing it meant staying in a hotel without a concierge. But Victoria wasn't just another rich person looking for a hobby. She was a sociopath with an MBA and unlimited resources, which made her exponentially more dangerous than your average trust fund brat. She had the intelligence to plan systematic destruction and the financial resources to execute it with legal protection. Her first move was purchasing the old McReady Resort property for $12 million cash, 3 times its assessed value, then immediately filing architectural plans for what she called Sterling Shore's luxury estate community. The plans were breathtaking in their scope and horrifying in their implications. 42 mansions priced between $5 to $15 million each, a private yacht club with helicopter landing pad, a spa that required importing mineral water from Switzerland, and a golf course that would require removing 300 acres of old-growth forest. The environmental impact study was a masterpiece of purchase science, claiming that the development would actually improve lake ecology by introducing managed landscaping and professional water quality oversight. The fact that her environmental consultants were being paid $50,000 per month by Sterling Properties might have influenced their conclusions. But hey, that's just good business, right? But Victoria's real weapon wasn't money. It was her supernatural ability to identify exactly what each person feared losing most, then systematically destroying it while maintaining plausible deniability and legal protection. She studied people like a predator studies prey, looking for emotional vulnerabilities and financial pressure points that could be exploited with surgical precision. The Henderson family had run the local marina for 40 years, providing boat repair services and fishing guide operations that supported dozens of local families. Suddenly, they faced safety violations that would cost $300,000 to remediate. The violations were creative masterpieces of bureaucratic harassment. Apparently, their 1970s-era fuel pumps didn't meet 2023 environmental standards, their boat lifts posed navigational hazards to luxury yachts, and their tackle shop was an aesthetic inconsistency that violated community standards Victoria had unilaterally established. When Bill Henderson protested that his marina had been grandfathered in under local zoning laws, Victoria's lawyers produced a 400-page legal brief arguing that grandfather clauses didn't apply to commercial operations in residential areas, and that the marina's continued operation would expose the HOA to liability risks that could cost millions in lawsuit settlements. The Martinez family's lakeside restaurant faced similar treatment. Rosa Martinez had been serving fish tacos and homemade pie to 3 generations of lake families, but according to Victoria's Community Standards Assessment, the restaurant's rustic appearance was inconsistent with luxury residential development and posed odor management challenges for neighboring properties. The violations were endless and increasingly absurd. The restaurant's hand-painted sign was non-compliant with community signage standards. Their outdoor seating area created noise pollution that exceeded residential limits. Even their vegetable garden was cited as unauthorized agricultural activity in a residential zone. Every citation came with fines that multiplied daily until families couldn't afford to fight anymore. Elderly Mrs. Chen received daily noise complaints about her rooster, Frederick, who'd been greeting the sunrise for 8 years without a single previous complaint. According to Victoria's Community Noise Assessment, Frederick's crowing exceeded decibel limits established for luxury residential environments and posed quality-of-life challenges for residents who'd paid premium prices for peaceful morning experiences. When Mrs. Chen pointed out that she'd owned Frederick since before Victoria arrived, she was informed that new HOA bylaws superseded previous arrangements and that livestock management was incompatible with community development goals. The daily fines started at $50 and doubled each week Frederick continued to exist. One by one, families who'd called Mirror Lake home for generations were being pressured to sell to Sterling Properties at 60 cents on the dollar. The pattern was always the same: overwhelming legal harassment, impossible remediation costs, and generous buyout offers that appeared just when families were most financially vulnerable. But I was her white whale. My island sat directly in the middle of her planned Sterling Shores Marina and Yacht Club. According to her architectural renderings, My family's century-old cabin was supposed to be demolished to make room for a floating champagne bar with underwater LED lighting and a helicopter pad for VIP arrivals who didn't want to waste time driving around the lake. The harassment campaign against me started subtle, probably because Victoria had researched my background and knew that direct intimidation might backfire against someone with academic credentials and tenure protection. She was smart enough to know that destroying a professor required different tactics than intimidating a small business owner. Property line disputes that required expensive surveys. Complaints about my unauthorized academic research materials, my books, being visible from the water and constituting visual pollution in a residential area. Claims that my rowboat was aesthetically inconsistent with community standards and that my dock posed navigational hazards for luxury watercraft that needed access to deeper water. When subtle didn't work, she escalated to financial warfare. Suddenly, my property taxes were reassessed at luxury residential rates instead of academic historical rates, tripling my annual tax burden. My homeowner's insurance was canceled due to elevated risk factors that no one could explain, but were apparently significant enough to make my property uninsurable. Even my internet service was mysteriously downgraded due to infrastructure limitations that affected only my island. But Victoria's most insidious weapon was psychological warfare that would have impressed military interrogators. She hired a private investigator to dig up everything about Emma's illness: medical records, treatment schedules, even the names of her doctors and the specific medications she'd taken. Then she started a whisper campaign suggesting that our island might be contaminated with something that caused childhood cancer. Just asking questions, she'd say with fake concern at community meetings, for the children's safety. When you have elevated cancer rates in such a small community, responsible people investigate potential environmental factors before more families are affected. The woman had weaponized my daughter's death against me, turning Emma's battle with leukemia into ammunition for a property dispute. She organized health and safety assessments that brought state environmental inspectors to our lake, not to investigate real contamination, but to create the impression that contamination existed. The inspectors found nothing, but the mere fact of their presence was enough to plant seeds of doubt in neighbors' minds. Victoria started hosting community health forums, where expensive doctors in designer suits discussed cancer clusters, environmental contamination, and the importance of proactive relocation when facing potential health hazards. The forums were recorded and edited into social media content that made our entire community look like a toxic waste site that responsible parents should evacuate immediately. But the attack that nearly broke me was purely personal. Victoria somehow obtained Emma's medical records and commissioned a retrospective health impact study that suggested her leukemia might have been caused by legacy environmental contamination on our island. The study was complete fiction, purchased science from a consulting firm that specialized in creating official-looking reports for legal proceedings. But it was detailed enough to be convincing, complete with statistical analysis, peer-reviewed citations, and expert testimony from doctors who'd never examined Emma or even visited our lake. Victoria presented this fabricated study at a community meeting, standing at a podium with charts and graphs that suggested my family had been living on a toxic waste site for generations, unknowingly poisoning our children while refusing to acknowledge the danger. "I know this is painful for Mr. Blackwood," she said, with the kind of fake sympathy that makes your skin crawl. "But we have a responsibility to protect other families from similar tragedies. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is help people accept reality and move forward with their lives." She had just suggested that Emma's death was my fault for refusing to sell our family home to someone who could manage the environmental risks properly. Sitting in that community center, surrounded by neighbors who'd known me for decades but were starting to look at me with suspicion and pity, I finally understood what kind of monster I was dealing with. This wasn't about property development or community improvement. This was about a sociopath who discovered that destroying people's lives gave her more satisfaction than any amount of money could buy. Victoria Sterling didn't just want to own Mirror Lake. She wanted to own the people who lived there, and she was willing to destroy anyone who refused to be owned. But Victoria had made one crucial error in her psychological profile of me. She'd assumed that a grieving father and small-town professor would be too broken and too poor to fight back against unlimited resources and professional intimidation. She had no idea that I'd spent 2 decades researching industrial families, labor disputes, and environmental cover-ups. And she definitely didn't know that the Sterling family name had been popping up in my research for years, always connected to projects that ended in mysterious deaths and buried court records. As I sat in my rowboat that morning, fishing pieces of Emma's bridge out of Mirror Lake, while Victoria probably sipped champagne and planned her next attack, I made a decision that would change everything. If Victoria Sterling wanted to destroy my family's legacy using lies and intimidation, I was going to destroy hers using the truth and the law. But first, I needed to understand exactly what kind of crimes the Sterling family had been hiding for a century. 20 years of academic research teaches you that every powerful family has skeletons, but the Sterling family had built an entire cemetery. I started where I always start, with public records that rich people assume nobody bothers to check. The first red flag was a 1924 congressional hearing about industrial accidents. Sterling Steel Works had the highest worker fatality rate in Pennsylvania, 37 deaths in a single year, but somehow avoided federal oversight. The hearing transcripts revealed testimony about mysterious illnesses, birth defects, and cancer clusters around Sterling facilities. But here's where it gets sinister. The witnesses started disappearing, not metaphorically, literally disappearing. Police reports were filed, then withdrawn. Families were paid to relocate and sign non-disclosure agreements. Dr. Margaret Hoffman, the public health official who'd compiled evidence of systematic poisoning, died in a car accident 3 days before she was scheduled to testify. The accident report described mechanical failure, but independent mechanics found evidence of sabotage that was never officially investigated. By 1925, the hearings had been quietly discontinued, and Sterling Industrial had expanded into 7 states, following the same pattern: buy up land around small communities, promise economic development, then systematically poison everything within a 50-mile radius while bribing officials to look the other way. The breakthrough came when I was going through personal effects that I'd inherited but never fully examined. In my grandmother's boxes, wrapped in oilcloth, was a hand-drawn map that made my blood run cold. The map showed Mirror Lake as it existed in 1923, before the dam expansion. But it wasn't just a surveyor's map. It was a record of industrial activity that had been hidden underwater for a century. Underground tunnels connected facilities to disposal areas beneath what was now the deepest part of the lake. Storage areas were marked with dates from 1923 to 1925, and chemical formulas that looked ominous even to someone with no chemistry background. Railroad spurs that no longer existed had carried materials from Sterling industrial facilities to carefully marked disposal sites that were now 50 feet underwater. What looked like a natural lake was actually a carefully engineered cover-up of the biggest environmental crime in state history. And my family's bridge had been built directly over the evidence. At the bottom, in Ezekiel's careful handwriting, "Sterling poison buried here. If anything happens to our family, show this to the federal authorities. The children's sickness is not God's will, it's Sterling greed." My great-great-grandfather hadn't just built a bridge. He'd built it over evidence of mass environmental destruction, positioned as both a monument to our family's refusal to be intimidated and a marker for the location of evidence that could destroy the Sterling Empire. Suddenly, Emma's research made horrible sense. The interesting letters she'd found weren't just historical curiosities. They were documentation of systematic poisoning that had been affecting families around Mirror Lake for a century. My daughter had discovered that her own illness was connected to environmental crimes that predated her birth, and I'd been too overwhelmed to pay attention to what she was telling me. I brought the map to Dr. Sarah Chen at the State University's Environmental Science Department. She took one look at the chemical formulas and her face went pale. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "these are early industrial solvents and heavy metals, mercury compounds, lead arsenate, chromium derivatives. If these chemicals have been leaching into the groundwater for 100 years. Could they explain childhood leukemia?" I asked, thinking about Emma. The silence in that laboratory was deafening. The data was devastating. Cancer rates around Mirror Lake were 40% higher than average. Birth defects triple the expected rate. Life expectancy 7 years below state averages. Mirror Lake wasn't a natural paradise. It was a toxic waste site disguised as a recreational area. But the map was just the beginning. Once I knew what to look for, Sterling industrial documents appeared everywhere, like pieces of a massive puzzle. Congressional testimony, where Sterling executives lied under oath about waste disposal practices. EPA studies from the 1970s that identified legacy contamination, but were never published due to national security concerns that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with political pressure from Sterling lobbyists. Insurance company records showing that Sterling Industrial had paid millions in accidental death settlements to families whose loved ones had died of natural causes that were actually chemical poisoning. Internal Sterling memos discussing waste management solutions and community relations challenges in language that made it clear they knew exactly what they were doing. A 1924 memo from Sterling Management. Disposal costs are cutting into profit margins. Find cheaper alternatives, even if it means working with local officials to modify oversight requirements. A 1925 progress report. Mirror Lake site exceeding disposal capacity. Recommend expanding operations and increasing community management activities to prevent interference from local populations. Most shocking was recent evidence. Victoria hadn't just inherited money. She'd inherited detailed knowledge of environmental crimes and had been actively concealing them. Sterling Properties had been purchasing land around contaminated sites for decades, not for development, but to control access and prevent environmental testing. Victoria's harassment campaign wasn't about development. It was about eliminating potential witnesses to environmental crimes that were still killing people a century later. Building a case against generational wealth requires the right team and an unbreakable commitment to justice. My first recruit was Dr. Sarah Chen, whose grandmother had died from Sterling industrial poisoning in the 1940s. Sarah brought scientific expertise and personal motivation that would drive her to work 18-hour days. Her grandmother, Li Wei Chen, had worked at a Sterling facility in the chemical processing division, handling materials that workers were told were completely safe, but were actually industrial solvents that caused neurological damage, cancer, and birth defects. Li Wei died of lung cancer at 34, leaving behind 3 children who all developed serious health problems before age 50. The Sterling family has been poisoning working families for a century, Sarah told me over coffee that tasted like justice brewing. If we can prove systematic environmental crimes, we can shut down their operations nationwide and maybe prevent other families from going through what mine did. Rebecca Martinez, a federal prosecutor, had been building a case against Sterling Industrial for years, but couldn't get enough evidence. Her family had also been destroyed by Sterling operations in the 1980s. Her father developed respiratory problems that forced early retirement. Her mother suffered a miscarriage attributed to environmental stress factors that were never investigated. When I showed her Ezekiel's map, her eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "This isn't just historical dumping," she explained, spreading documents across her conference table like battle plans. "If these chemicals are still present, it's ongoing environmental terrorism. We can file federal charges that could result in criminal prosecution and asset forfeiture that would bankrupt the Sterling family completely." Environmental crimes carry unique legal advantages. Unlike most criminal cases where you need to prove intent, environmental crimes only require proof that contamination occurred and that defendants knew about it. The Sterling family's century-long cover-up actually worked against them legally. Every bribe, every intimidation campaign, every fraudulent study was evidence of knowledge and intent to conceal criminal activity. Dr. Carmen Martinez, Emma's oncologist, became our medical expert. She'd been tracking cancer patterns for years and had data showing Mirror Lake had 5 times the state's pediatric cancer rate, 17 children diagnosed with various cancers over 30 years in a community of fewer than 500 people. Emma's leukemia wasn't random, she told me during our meeting at the hospital where Emma had fought for her life. It was caused by systematic poisoning that's been affecting families around Mirror Lake for generations. Your daughter was murdered by corporate greed, and it's still happening to other children. The medical evidence Carmen had compiled was devastating. Blood tests showing elevated heavy metals in local children, tissue samples containing industrial chemicals banned since the 1970s. Genetic damage consistent with multi-generational exposure to environmental toxins still present in dangerous concentrations. While my team gathered evidence, Sarah conducted secret environmental testing using university resources. Working at night with small boats, her team collected water and sediment samples from locations marked on Ezekiel's map. The results were worse than expected. Lead levels 400 times federal limits, mercury contamination throughout the ecosystem, and isotopic analysis proving the contamination came from Sterling industrial operations. "This isn't just historical pollution," Sarah explained, while showing me laboratory results that looked like an environmental disaster report. "These chemicals are still leaching from buried waste sites. Every day that families continue living around this lake, they're being exposed to toxins that will affect their children and grandchildren." Meanwhile, Victoria escalated her psychological warfare to levels that revealed both her desperation and complete indifference to legal boundaries. A fake cancer study appeared, warning families about contamination while recommending evacuation through Sterling Properties' Relocation Assistance Program. Property condemnation notices followed, claiming my island was environmentally hazardous. The most vicious attack came when actors posed as Child Protective Services investigators, claiming to check for environmental hazards that might affect my mental health. Watching strangers rifle through Emma's belongings, her books, her art supplies, her half-finished diary, claiming they were protecting other children, something fundamental shifted inside me. This wasn't about property anymore. This was about a family that had been poisoning children for a century, then hiding behind lawyers and money when anyone tried to stop them. Victoria Sterling was literally desecrating my daughter's memory to protect her family's environmental crimes. That night, I called Rebecca Martinez and said something that surprised both of us. "I don't want their money. I want them in prison." "Marcus," she said carefully, "federal environmental crimes can carry sentences of 20 to 30 years each. If we prove systematic contamination and cover-up, Victoria Sterling could spend the rest of her life in federal prison." "Good," I said, looking at Emma's photo on my desk. "But that's not enough. I want to destroy their ability to hurt anyone else's children, ever again. The best traps use your enemy's greatest strength against them." Victoria's absolute confidence that money could solve any problem was about to become her greatest weakness. The bait was perfect in its simplicity. I announced publicly that I was rebuilding the bridge using historically accurate materials and techniques, and that during foundation work, I discovered fascinating industrial artifacts buried in the lakebed that I planned to donate to the State Historical Society for preservation and display. I made sure this announcement reached Victoria through 3 different channels designed to create maximum paranoia about potential evidence exposure. First, a formal letter to the State Historical Society requesting guidance on proper preservation techniques for industrial artifacts discovered during construction activities. Second, social media posts about the amazing discovery of century-old industrial materials that would shed new light on our community's industrial heritage. Third, casual mentions to Mrs. Chen at the grocery store about interesting old machinery parts, which in a small town was equivalent to broadcasting on national television. Within 48 hours, Victoria took the bait in ways that exceeded my wildest expectations. Her first response was financial, a generous offer of $5 million cash for my island, with a 48-hour acceptance deadline. The offer letter, delivered by courier at 6 a.m., explained that Sterling Properties was expediting acquisition of historically significant properties for inclusion in a community heritage preservation project. The irony was beautiful. Victoria was offering to preserve historical artifacts by destroying the evidence of her family's crimes, and she was doing it with enough urgency to prove she knew exactly what those artifacts might reveal. When I declined the offer publicly, posting on social media that our family's bridge isn't for sale at any price, Victoria escalated to legal intimidation that revealed both her desperation and her family's extensive resources for silencing opposition. Cease and desist letters arrived from 3 different law firms, each representing different aspects of Sterling Properties operations. The letters claimed I was trespassing on Sterling Properties land, completely false, conducting unauthorized archaeological excavation, not a real crime, and interfering with community development activities, not illegal unless you're engaged in illegal development. But the most revealing letter came from a firm specializing in environmental law, claiming that my excavation activities posed significant environmental risks and demanding immediate cessation pending professional environmental assessment. The beautiful irony was that Victoria's lawyers were accidentally confessing to environmental contamination while trying to stop me from discovering evidence of environmental crimes. Victoria's most damaging response was direct criminal action that we documented with hidden cameras positioned throughout the lake area. At 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, I watched through night vision equipment as 6 men in hazmat suits began systematically dredging the lake bottom near my bridge foundations. They weren't looking for contamination. They were looking for evidence of Sterling industrial dumping operations. And more importantly, they were destroying it. The operation was sophisticated and expensive. Professional diving equipment, industrial dredging tools, and transportation vehicles that must have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to deploy. Every moment was captured in high-definition video that would make federal prosecutors weep with joy. License plates, faces, equipment serial numbers, and audio recordings of the crew discussing their instructions to remove any materials that might connect to Sterling operations. Federal obstruction of justice charges carry 10-year sentences each. Victoria had just committed at least 6 felonies while I filmed every second from multiple angles. While her people committed crimes to destroy evidence, Victoria launched a public relations campaign designed to discredit me and justify her actions to the community. Emergency flyers appeared throughout the community, warning about environmental hazards created by unauthorized excavation activities on my property. Victoria organized community safety meetings, where expensive consultants in designer suits discussed the dangers of disturbing contaminated sediments. The meetings were masterfully orchestrated psychological manipulation. Victoria positioned herself as the responsible adult, protecting the community from a grieving father whose emotional instability was creating environmental hazards that threatened everyone's children. Most insidiously, she made subtle suggestions that my discovery of industrial artifacts proved my property was contaminated with materials that might have caused Emma's cancer. When criminal sabotage and public relations manipulation failed, Victoria escalated to direct legal warfare. Property condemnation notices arrived claiming my island posed immediate environmental hazards. Emergency restraining orders prevented me from continuing bridge construction. Victoria even filed federal EPA complaints against me, claiming my construction violated the Clean Water Act, using federal environmental regulations as weapons against the person trying to expose environmental crimes. The trap culminated at a community meeting where Victoria's environmental experts took the stage to present their findings about the dangers I supposedly posed to community safety. That's when Dr. Sarah Chen stood up in the audience with a briefcase full of real environmental data and asked a simple question that shattered Victoria's carefully constructed narrative. Before we discuss Mr. Blackwood's construction activities, could you explain why your 2019 environmental assessment failed to identify the industrial contamination that's been documented by these federal water quality tests? The room went dead silent as Sarah connected her laptop to the projector and displayed 18 months of scientific data proving that Mirror Lake had been contaminated with exactly the chemicals shown on Ezekiel's 1923 map. Charts and graphs filled the projection screen, showing contamination levels that had existed for decades before I'd begun any construction activities. Victoria's face went through more color changes than a traffic light as she realized she'd been outmaneuvered by people who understood environmental science better than her purchased consultants. But instead of backing down, Victoria's arrogance took over completely. "This is ridiculous," she announced, standing up with the kind of fury that only comes from generational entitlement. "My family has been responsible stewards of this community for generations. These accusations are nothing but desperate attempts by someone who can't accept progress and refuses to take responsibility for his own environmental negligence." That's when I stood up and delivered the words I'd been practicing for weeks. "Mrs. Sterling, if your family has been such responsible stewards, could you explain why your great-grandfather's company illegally dumped industrial waste in this lake from 1923 to 1925? Why your grandfather bribed federal investigators to cover it up, and why you've spent the past year systematically intimidating families to prevent them from discovering the truth about what killed their children?" I produced Ezekiel's map, holding it up for the entire room to see. The silence was deafening as 200 community members realized they were looking at evidence of environmental crimes that had been hidden for a century. Next came the chemical analysis, the historical documents, and finally, recordings of Victoria's own people discussing legacy contamination issues. But Victoria's response was the final nail in her coffin. So, what if there was some minor industrial waste? That was a different time with different standards. My family has invested millions in improving this community, and we're not going to let some disgruntled professor destroy everything we've built over ancient history that has nothing to do with current operations. She had just confessed to knowing about the contamination, dismissed a century of environmental crimes as ancient history, and admitted that current Sterling Properties operations were connected to historical crimes. When the room erupted in outrage and people began demanding answers, she made the statement that would ensure federal prison. These people should be grateful for the community improvements we've provided instead of dwelling on the past. Some families just aren't suited for luxury living, and maybe it's time they found communities more appropriate to their circumstances. That's when the doors opened and FBI agents entered, led by Agent Sarah Rodriguez carrying federal arrest warrants. "Victoria Sterling," Agent Rodriguez announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct federal environmental investigations, witness intimidation, violations of the Clean Water Act, and continuing criminal enterprise." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Victoria's last words were, "This is impossible. My lawyers will have me out in an hour. You people don't understand who you're dealing with." She had no idea that her lawyers were about to be arrested too, and that federal asset forfeiture meant she wouldn't be able to afford new ones. The trap had worked perfectly. Victoria's arrogance had provided federal prosecutors with more evidence than they typically collected in years of investigation. 6 months later, I'm sitting on my rebuilt bridge, constructed with materials donated by families whose loved ones had been poisoned by Sterling Industrial for generations, watching the sunrise paint Mirror Lake in colors that haven't been seen in a century. The water is clearer than it's been since before Sterling Industrial began operations. Real environmental remediation has removed millions of gallons of contaminated sediment, and fish populations are showing dramatic recovery that environmental scientists are calling miraculous. But the real transformation happened to the people, and the ripple effects of our victory have spread far beyond Mirror Lake to become a model for environmental justice nationwide. Victoria Sterling's legal reckoning was swift, absolute, and historically significant. The federal charges multiplied faster than cancer cells, as investigators discovered the full scope of the Sterling family's criminal enterprise spanning 4 generations and 17 states. The trial lasted 8 weeks and featured testimony from 847 victims, whose families had been poisoned by Sterling operations, environmental scientists who presented evidence of contamination in 43 communities, and former Sterling employees who described decades of deliberate waste disposal in protected waterways. But the most damning testimony came from Victoria herself, who took the stand in her own defense against her lawyer's advice and spent 4 days explaining why environmental laws didn't apply to families with generational investments in community development and historical contributions to American industrial progress. Her testimony was a masterclass in sociopathic arrogance that sealed her fate. Victoria actually argued that the suffering of families like mine was an acceptable cost of economic development, and that holding her family responsible for historical decisions made under different legal standards would create dangerous precedents for American business. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all counts. Victoria Sterling was sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole under the continuing criminal enterprise statute. The judge, in imposing sentence, noted that the Sterling family's environmental crimes represented one of the most extensive and deliberate campaigns of environmental terrorism in American history. The defendant's family has systematically poisoned communities for over a century, Judge Patricia Hawkins stated. The evidence shows not only knowledge of ongoing harm, but deliberate concealment and active intimidation of victims. This court finds that the defendant poses a continuing threat to public health and environmental safety. Victoria's assets, every mansion, every yacht, every piece of jewelry, every stock option, every bank account, and every offshore tax haven were forfeited under federal racketeering statutes. The Sterling family fortune, built on a century of environmental crimes, was liquidated to pay for cleanup costs and victim compensation. The $200 million Victoria had inherited became seed money for the largest environmental justice fund in American history, providing medical care for families affected by industrial contamination and funding long-term environmental monitoring to prevent future tragedies. But Victoria's conviction was just the beginning. The Sterling case opened investigations into environmental crimes by dozens of other industrial families who'd used similar tactics to hide contamination and silence victims. Federal prosecutors used our model to build cases against corporations that thought their crimes were too old to prosecute. The legal principle of continuing criminal enterprise meant that companies could be held liable for environmental damage as long as contamination continued to affect communities, even if the original dumping occurred decades ago. Sterling industrial subsidiaries in 17 states were shut down pending environmental assessment. Cleanup operations at contaminated sites employed thousands of workers and generated billions in economic activity for communities that had been devastated by industrial pollution. But the most significant impact was legislative. The Sterling Environmental Justice Act, passed by Congress 8 months after Victoria's conviction, created new legal mechanisms for prosecuting environmental crimes and provided federal funding for community-led environmental monitoring. The Mirror Lake community that emerged from this battle was stronger than anyone had imagined possible. Families who'd been intimidated into silence found their voices. Neighbors who'd been divided by Victoria's manipulation came together around shared values of environmental protection and community support. The Sterling Shores luxury development was converted into the Ezekiel Blackwood Environmental Education Center, where school groups learn about the importance of protecting water resources and holding corporations accountable for environmental crimes. The center features interactive exhibits about industrial pollution, community organizing, and legal advocacy. Emma's research is displayed prominently, showing how young people can contribute to environmental justice by asking difficult questions and demanding accountability from powerful institutions. Visitors from around the world come to study our community's transformation from environmental disaster zone to model of environmental justice. The center hosts conferences, research projects, and advocacy training that has influenced environmental policy nationwide. But the most important change happened inside me. Fighting for Emma's memory had given me a purpose I'd lost when she died, and channeling grief into action had created something positive from the worst tragedy of my life. The Marcus Blackwood Environmental Foundation, which I established with part of the $2.3 million settlement from Sterling Industrial, provides free legal aid to families fighting environmental contamination. We've helped 127 families across 12 states, with a success rate of 94%. Turns out that when you combine academic research skills with federal law enforcement, corporate criminals don't stand a chance. Our success has inspired similar organizations nationwide, and the Foundation's legal strategies have been adopted by environmental justice advocates who face similar battles against corporate polluters. But the Foundation's proudest achievement is the scholarship program for environmental science students. Every year, we award full college scholarships to young people who want to study lake ecology, environmental law, or sustainable development. The first recipient was Dr. Sarah Chen's daughter, who's now studying environmental engineering and plans to become the next generation of lake protectors. The lake itself has become a success story that environmental groups point to as proof that ecosystems can recover when illegal pollution is stopped and proper remediation is conducted. Fish populations have increased by 340% in just 6 months. Water clarity has improved to levels not seen since the 1990s. Migratory birds have returned to nest in the restored wetlands, and the toxic algae blooms that plagued the lake during the resort's operation have completely disappeared. My boat building workshop has been expanded into a teaching facility where I pass on traditional craftsmanship techniques to young people who want to learn skills that connect them to the natural world. The smell of cedar shavings and varnish still fills the air, but now it's mixed with the voices of students learning to shape wood with their hands instead of depending on machines for everything. The bridge itself has become a symbol of resistance that draws visitors from around the country. People come to see the structure that sparked a battle against corruption and won. They walk across the hand-hewn planks that my great-great-grandfather carved in 1923, and they understand that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how powerful the opposition seems. Every morning, I sit on this bridge with my coffee and Emma's diary, reading about her dreams for the future and the environmental justice work she wanted to pursue. Her research notes, displayed in the Education Center, continue to inspire young scientists who understand that asking the right questions can change the world. The morning mist rises off the lake as I finish my coffee and prepare for another day of teaching and advocacy. The sound of loons calling to each other echoes across the water, a sound that had almost disappeared during the resort's operation, but has returned now that the lake is healing. Standing here on this bridge, I can feel Emma's presence in every ripple on the water and every breath of clean air. Her fight isn't over, it's just getting started through the work of everyone she's inspired. Before I sign off, I want to hear from you. Drop your worst environmental nightmare in the comments below. Share this story with anyone dealing with corporate pollution, HOA harassment, or environmental injustice. Knowledge is power, and the more people who know their rights, the harder it becomes for environmental criminals to operate in the shadows. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see more stories about ordinary people standing up to corporate power and winning. Because Emma's legacy isn't just about one family's fight for justice. It's about creating a world where children don't get sick because powerful people prioritize profits over public health. The sun is fully up now, painting the lake in colors that remind me why this place is worth protecting. The bridge my great-great-grandfather built stands solid beneath my feet, and the water that 4 generations of my family have called home is finally clean enough for future generations to enjoy safely. Some fights are worth having, some bridges are worth building, and some victories are worth sharing with the world. Thanks for joining me in the fight for environmental justice. Until next time, keep holding the powerful accountable.